Hi, my name is Wayne Botha, and this video gives you the benefit of my experiences using freshly harvested wet hops in your harvest ales each year. I have brewed with freshly harvested, locally grown hops for the past few seasons. I'm sharing my experiences here to save you time and help you get better experiences from using freshly harvested hops. I brew harvest ales in 5-gallon batches using hops grown in Connecticut, and this video is based on my experiences under these conditions. I have laid out this knowledge in a logical sequence from recipe formulation through harvesting to dry hopping. Now, the first question that comes to mind when talking about brewing with locally grown wet hops is why bother? And the answer is because you can. So it is much easier and more convenient to brew with pellet hops. However, there is no substitute for the amount of marketing and community interaction that comes from harvesting hops and using them in a harvest ale. The whole experience of growing hops and then using those locally grown hops in a harvest ale that you can then share within your community is such an unusual activity that consumers who are craft beer drinkers gather around for the event. They pay attention and they actually enjoy being involved in the whole experience. Also, at least in Connecticut, the end of the harvest season signifies the end of summer and the start of fall. The hardest part of working with freshly picked hops is in formulating the recipe. You have to make educated guesses because you don't know exactly how much hops you will get from the harvest or exactly what the level of alpha acids will be. Here is some knowledge that I've gleaned over the past few years from working directly with fresh hops and also from my research into using fresh hops into beer. First of all, wet hops are 80% moisture. When the hops are harvested, like within the hour that they're harvested, is the best time to measure the weight of the hops. That is 80% moisture at that point. So you can assume that 20% of the hop weight is the same as the normal dry hop value for recipe calculation. For example, if you harvest 10 ounces of fresh hops, then it's the equivalent of 2 ounces of dry hops for your recipe calculations. So the moisture content varies during the day. This is important because it affects the weight of the hops. So one time I harvested hops in the early morning after we'd had a rainy spell, and the hops weighed more than they would normally if you had harvested them in the late afternoon after a dry spell. This isn't really a big issue, it's just something to bear in mind. So when it comes to formulating a recipe for your beers, assume that the average alpha acid for the variety is what you've got. So Cascade hops range from 4.5% to 7% alpha acids. For your recipe formulation, just assume 5.5%. My experience and research says that the hop variety stays close to its genetic base and it doesn't stray widely. So if you use an average for that variety, then it's good enough for recipe formulation. When it comes to formulating a recipe for harvest ales, too much hops is better than too little. What I mean by that is that craft beer drinkers seek out harvest ales because they want to taste the hops. Nobody wants a fresh hopped cream ale. So craft brewers who support harvest ales and drink harvest ales want to taste the hops, and they don't want to drink a harvest ale which has got no flavor at all. So if you need to make a decision as to how many hops to put in, remember to rather add more than add less. Whole hops absorb more wort than pellet hops in the kettle, but there is a dependency on how wet or dry the hops are. If you use hops that were picked within 12 hours, then you don't lose much wort. Maybe you lose a quarter gallon for a 5-gallon batch. The hops absorb more wort when they're dry. For example, if you use the hops after a week, then they can absorb as much as 3/4 gallons of wort in the boil kettle. So obviously, as the hops absorb more wort, it impacts your gravity and also the volume of beer going into the fermenter. Number 6. You can use an online hop calculator or brewing software to exactly estimate the number of IBUs. I use brewing software to help in guesstimating because trying to exactly estimate IBUs can be more work than it is worth. All you have to keep in mind is that craft beer drinkers seeking a harvest ale want to taste the hops. Don't get wrapped around the axle by trying to get accurate IBU estimates for your harvest ales. I use wet hops for bittering additions to boil off the vegetal flavors. Traditional advice given to homebrewers is to use pellet hops for the bittering additions and to keep your homegrown hops for the late additions and for dry hopping. But what I found the hard way is that wet hops have certain flavors that need to be boiled off in the kettle. Otherwise, you get a diacetyl wax-like substance in the final beer. Don't use wet hops for dry hopping. The wet hops have got other substances in them which appear to need to be boiled off in order to give you the right flavors. I found that as you add wet hops to a beer and directly into the boil kettle, it smells like broccoli. So obviously the first aromas that are coming off the wet hops are actually vegetal flavors and aromas. And if you don't boil those off, then you get that vegetal aroma and flavor in your beer. And I'm not one for a broccoli harvest ale. All right, let's talk a little bit about harvesting fresh hops. Varieties mature at different times, and plants yield differently depending on the growing conditions for that year. Factors such as the amount of water that the plants got and the amount of fertilizer applied impact the yield and the maturity date for each variety. It is very hard to plan for the actual harvest date. So what I've done is record the dates that a friend of mine harvested hops in South Windsor, and this is just an example of harvesting dates in my area. Yours will obviously vary depending on your conditions and your climate. So in our case, in 2015, my friends and I harvested Cascade on the 25th of August. In 2016, we harvested Cascade on the 23rd of August. In 2017, we harvested Cascade on August the 18th. And so you get the picture that Cascades usually mature in around the middle of August. However, Willamette matures and is harvested around the end of July. Now the interesting thing is that Crystal is a very late bloomer, and Crystal matures around the end of September every year into early October. And so these timelines are important because it means that the Cascade can be harvested and already fermented out before the Crystal is actually ready to be harvested. You can take this into consideration when planning your harvest ale party, and you can actually have the Cascade harvest ale at the party on the same day that people are busy harvesting the crystal hops, and that just ties it really nicely together so that you can share your beers and the hop experience with your community. Alright, let's talk a little bit about drying. After you've harvested hops, you can either use them immediately and put them into a boil kettle on the same day, which is usually what I do, or you can keep your hops for a few days and let them dry out. The key to keeping hops for a few days is to make sure that they get plenty of air. Hops don't need heat to dry out, they just need a good flow of air. And so you can spread the hops out on screens, or you can put them on a piece of cardboard, but the key is just to keep them spread out and to turn them so that they don't sit in a heap. Now it's important to note that wet hops lose most of their moisture in about 2 days, and so you should weigh your hops as soon as they are harvested and use that weight in all the formulas and your calculations. Don't worry about the weight as it gets less over the next few days. And so now let's talk a little about using freshly harvested whole hops in the boil kettle. Wet hops pose some situations that you don't get with pellet hops. Firstly, they can kill the boil when you add too much hops to the boil kettle at once. For example, if you add 20 ounces of wet hops, they will kill the boil for about 5 minutes. Take this into consideration and boil for 5 minutes longer if you plan to add a large amount of hops at once. Secondly, wet hops can take up a lot of space in the boil kettle. Wet hops are bulky. I have found that 50 ounces of wet hops in 5 gallons of beer is way too much, and it gets to the point where you cannot keep the hops submerged in the beer. Therefore, the maximum amount of fresh hops that you can fit into a beer is approximately 8 ounces of hops per gallon of beer. And then thirdly, wet hops retain heat when you're busy cooling the beer. It takes longer to cool a beer with whole hops and wet hops than it does with normal pellet hops. Now it's around 12:30, just after noon on Saturday, and these are the hops that we picked a few hours ago. So within a few hours they are going into the kettle. These hops are just as they came off the vine. I can't do that for too long, but just as they came off the vine, nice fresh hops, and they're busy going into the boil kettle. This is how we add the hops to the boil kettle. These are, like I said, wet hops, but they just go straight into the boil kettle. No pressing, no drying, no nothing. They just go straight in and they make delicious hop soup. It's almost like chicken soup, except it's for men or women. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about dry hopping. In my experience, you should never use freshly harvested hops for dry hopping. Freshly harvested hops have vegetal tastes and aromas that come through in the final beer, and if you use those hops for dry hopping, they actually ruin the beer. In summary, every brewer should create harvest ales every year. Fresh hopped harvest ales put you in touch with your local hop growers and involve your community like nothing else. Harvest ales give you a reason to celebrate the hop harvest by having a number of events at your brewery around this time,